Good afternoon. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out and helping with my speech. This is going to be my third speech. It's going to be the informative speech. For this speech, I'm going to do a project talking about the Milgram experiment that was taking place in 1964. It was performed by Stanley Milgram, a social psychologist. A little bit about my background and why I feel that this is a good experiment to talk about is my field of study is in criminology. I study how crime is more associated with how the mindset is and how society influenced that crime to happen, how deviant behavior becomes possible. This experiment links to that pretty well because this experiment actually talks about how social influence affects people's obedience. If someone of authority tells another person of a lower standard to do something, that person has that drive to be obedient. So this kind of explains how things in history have occurred. Different war crimes and things like that. People want to know why the underlings were able to do such horrific crimes when the generals told them to do it. So that's why I kind of picked this project and why I feel this project is kind of important to talk about. With the Milgram experiment, he came up with the idea he wanted to test how people's obedience was affected by social influence and also by stress. So how he set out to do this in 1964 was he placed an ad in the paper. In this ad he said he was looking for test subjects that wanted to come down and learn and be tested on how learning is affected by negative influences. So what these test subjects thought they were going to do was they were going to have another individual going to take simple tests and they were going to give simple negative results for the wrong answers on that test. What actually occurred was they hired an actor that was going to play the test subject, and they brought in these 40 participants that they chose from ages 20 to 60 were actually the ones that were getting tested themselves. I have a little display here to help illustrate this. What we had was the teacher, this guy here, with the age group 20 to 60, the 40 different people that were chosen were actually labeled a teacher in this experiment. The learner in this experiment was actually an actor that was paid. He actually had a script. He knew what he was going to do. The trick was the teacher did not know this individual was an actor. He thought he was part of the 40 participants that were picked. So what they would do is they would bring in the teacher, show him the chair that this learner is going to be strapped into, which would resemble an electric chair actually. They would then give the learner a test shock. They would shock them with 45 volts to let them know that this was an actual real thing, and it did kind of hurt, was not going to feel real good for this person. They would then take the teacher into a separate room, which is what this illustrates here. Our learner, the actor, would be sitting in this room across. There would be one wall dividing them. Our teacher would be sitting here next to our little control panel, which I'll talk about in a second. And our experimenter, the actual scientist in the room that was going to be the one giving the orders and being the authority in the room, sat right here with this nice little lab coat. As we can see him right here, chaining the guy in. What actually would happen was, once the learner was chained into his chair, he would actually, when they left the room, he would get up, unstrap himself, and then follow the script that he was given. Unbeknownst to the teacher, he was not strapped into the device. The device here is the control panel, which he would be sat at. Actually went from 15 volts all the way to 450 volts. 450 volts is a lot of voltage. As a child, I took a 9-volt battery, which I'm sure most of us done, stuck it to my tongue. That did not feel good at all. I could not imagine getting shocked in a one pulse of up to 450 volts. What Milgram and his associates thought would happen was the teacher would refuse to continue shocking the learner once the learner started complaining in pain. It's not going to feel good. I mean, 15 volts is not going to feel good in the beginning. And with each wrong answer that this gentleman was given on a simple memory test, he would get 15 volts, and it would increase by 15 volts. So imagine that. So it's a 3-word memory test. So each time he could not get all 3 words the same again, he got the wrong answer. So there's 15 volts. Does it again, 30 volts. Does it again, 45 volts. All the way to 450 volts. That's going to be pretty painful. It's going to be kind of hard to understand and remember those words when you're getting shocked and scared you're going to get shocked. So the teacher, they would begin shocking them. The learner, following his script, would start by at 75 volts, 90 volts, and 105 volts. They would begin to moan in pain and yell how it hurt and they wanted to be let go. At 270 volts, they would begin to scream in pain, yelling that they had chest pains, that it was hurting, they wanted to be let go. This was not part of what they thought it was going to be. And at 350 volts, they were demanding that they be released. This was not part of their deal. It was too painful. They needed to go. They had a heart condition. Above 315 volts, there was dead silence. There was no response. There was no response on the board saying they answered the question. Yet the proctor, the scientist, demanded that they continue going. Even though the people, the teachers, were having visible dismay in it. They could tell that they were discomfortable. They did not like doing this. They did not like shocking this person. They felt they were actually hurting that person. Yet they continued to go on. The interesting thing that Milgram discovered was that out of the 40 participants that were chosen for the experiment, 26 out of the 40 went all the way to 450 volts. So even after 350 volts, they were getting no response from the participant. They continued to shock them because the proctor told them to keep going. He told them it was part of the experiment, that he would assume all responsibility for the other participant, and that for the experiment to actually be concluded and for it to be useful, they had to continue. So following those orders, they continued to shock, even though they were getting no response at 350 volts. The remaining 14 participants that did not go all the way to 450 volts and refused to go on, never stopped before 300 volts. That's amazing that out of all 40 people, nobody would stop before 300 volts of shocking somebody. At 300 volts, you have a poor little learner and they're screaming he has a heart problem, that he wants to go, that it is hurting. And yet the teacher, following simple orders, continued to shock on. What I think this illustrates and helps to help us learn about deviant behavior and how things occur out in society is that it may not always be the individual that is committing these crimes. It may also be society influencing that individual and greater authorities coming down and influencing this individual. So for us to better solve crime, I think we need to start looking at studies like this and how they have affected us. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out for my speech. Thank you and have a good afternoon.